Rachel Johnson stood outside the local courthouse with a handmade sign that read, "Mental health is not a crime." The chill of early autumn wrapped around her, but she barely noticed the cold. Her heart raced with both anticipation and frustration. For years, she had watched the mental health crisis grow in her community. Hospitals overwhelmed, people with serious conditions falling through the cracks, and the system failing them at every turn. The community's resources were thin at best, and the ones who suffered the most were the most vulnerable: the homeless, the mentally ill, and families struggling to cope. As she stood there, she remembered the countless people she had met along her journey, individuals who had been denied care simply because they didn't have the right insurance or enough money. She thought of her own brother, who had been left in a jail cell for hours after a mental health episode because no one knew what to do. "This needs to change," she thought to herself as she held up her sign higher. But her peaceful protest soon drew the attention of local law enforcement. A police officer approached her, his boots clicking sharply against the concrete as he surveyed the scene. "You're going to need to pack up, Mom," he said, his voice flat and official. "You're causing a disturbance." Rachel's chest tightened, but she remained calm. "I'm not disturbing anyone," she replied. "I'm protesting for mental health reform. We need to be heard." The officer sighed. "I understand what you're saying, but you can't just stand here like this. It's a violation of city ordinances." Rachel glanced around. The only people within sight were a few pedestrians passing by, all of whom seemed too preoccupied to notice her presence. She had expected more people to join her, but the town's apathy to mental health was a constant weight. It had always been this way, but today she wasn't going to let fear stop her. Before she could respond, a squad car arrived, and another officer stepped out. Within minutes, the situation escalated. The officers told her that she was obstructing traffic and that she would be fined for her actions. Rachel was shocked. She had broken no laws. She was only standing with a sign in the same spot she had stood countless times before. Only this time, she was being penalized. The officers handcuffed her as a crowd began to form at a distance, murmuring in confusion. Rachel was taken to the station, where the fine was issued, and her protest was dismissed. As she sat in a holding cell, waiting for her release, she felt a deep sense of injustice. But Rachel wasn't about to back down. If anything, this only fueled her resolve. There was a bigger battle ahead, and she was just getting started. The media, at first, barely noticed the story, but that was about to change. The fine wasn't the end for Rachel. It was the beginning of something much bigger. As soon as she was released from the station, she posted about her experience on social media. The caption was simple, yet powerful. "I was fined today for standing up for mental health reform. But this fight is far from over. It's time we stand up and demand better for those who need help the most." She included a photo of her holding the protest sign, which had now been folded up and stuffed into her bag, a symbol of her resilience. Almost immediately, the post began to gain traction. People from all over the country shared it, tagging their local politicians, health officials, and friends. Her words resonated with many who had experienced the same struggles in their own communities, families who had loved ones with mental health issues and felt the sting of a broken system. But not everyone was on her side. As the post spread, some online commenters dismissed her as a troublemaker, someone who didn't understand the law or the real issues at hand. "If you want change, do it the right way," one comment read. "Protests don't solve problems, they just make things worse." Others accused her of grandstanding, using the protests to further her personal agenda. Despite the negativity, Rachel felt a sense of relief. The conversation had started. Within a few hours, local news stations began to pick up the story. A reporter appeared at her doorstep the following morning, eager to hear more. He had seen her social media post and wanted an interview. "Tell us about why you were protesting," the reporter asked, holding the camera steady. "What are you hoping to achieve?" Rachel took a deep breath and launched into her story. She spoke of the countless families who had reached out to her for help, the ones who had been turned away by hospitals, the individuals who had been arrested instead of treated. She shared her own experiences, including her brother's struggle with mental illness and the time he had spent in jail after his condition worsened, because there were no mental health services available to him. She explained that mental illness shouldn't be criminalized. It should be treated with compassion and care. The story aired that evening, and suddenly, Rachel was a name everyone in town was talking about. Her protest wasn't just a small local act of defiance. It had turned into a symbol of a much-needed change. As the story spread to other cities, it caught the attention of national mental health organizations, advocacy groups, and even politicians. People who had been silent about the issue for too long were now ready to speak out. And all the while, Rachel's heart raced, not from fear, but from excitement. The spark had been lit. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was the fight of countless others who felt invisible in a system that had ignored their cries for help. It was time to push forward, no matter the cost. As Rachel's protest story continued to gain momentum, the attention it attracted went far beyond the small town where it began. National outlets began covering her story, and soon the details of her life and work came to light, showing a far more complex and powerful picture than anyone had imagined. A journalist from a major news network dug deeper into Rachel's background, uncovering a wealth of information that many had overlooked. He discovered that Rachel Johnson wasn't just a protester. She was a highly respected mental health advocate with an impressive track record in the field. For years, Rachel had worked tirelessly with national organizations, lobbying for better access to mental health care for underserved communities, particularly low-income families and people of color. Her work spanned across federal programs, helping to shape policy aimed at improving mental health services nationwide. Rachel had been one of the key contributors to the Mental Health Access Act, a bill designed to provide more funding for community-based mental health services and expand the availability of care in rural areas. Her advocacy had brought her into close contact with lawmakers, doctors, and mental health experts. She had spoken at conferences and worked directly with congressional leaders to push for meaningful reforms. Yet despite her professional successes, Rachel remained humble. She often said that the most rewarding part of her work was hearing from people who had been directly impacted by the system, those who felt forgotten, silenced, or misunderstood. Her passion for mental health reform wasn't just rooted in her career, it was deeply personal. Her brother, Marcus, had been diagnosed with schizophrenia when they were teenagers. Over the years, he had struggled to find consistent, effective care, and the burden of navigating a broken system weighed heavily on Rachel's shoulders. Marcus's battle had sparked her commitment to ensure that others didn't suffer the way he had. As the journalist's findings were published, the public's perception of Rachel began to shift. People now saw her not just as someone who was angry at a broken system, but as a seasoned advocate with years of experience and a deep personal connection to the issue. The story painted a vivid picture of the woman behind the protest, showing her to be someone who had dedicated her life to this cause. She wasn't just fighting for change. She had been actively working for it at the highest levels of government for years. This revelation hit Judge Harris particularly hard. He had been unaware of Rachel's background when he imposed the fine. To him, she was just another protester breaking the law. But now, as he watched the media coverage and read the articles about her work, he felt a growing sense of regret. He had dismissed her too quickly. The more he learned, the more he realized he had misjudged her. Rachel wasn't just a troublemaker. She was a hero. And the judge began to wonder if he might be part of the problem. Judge William Harris sat at his desk, his brow furrowed as he scrolled through the articles and interviews that had flooded the media in the days following Rachel Johnson's protest. The headline that caught his eye read, "Advocate for Mental Health Reform Faces Fine for Public Protest." His eyes lingered on the photo of Rachel, standing tall and determined with her protest sign. The woman he had fined just a week ago now seemed entirely different, her message ringing louder with every word he read. Rachel's background, the one he had failed to investigate before issuing the fine, painted a picture of a woman with an undeniable passion for change. She had been working in mental health advocacy for over a decade, fighting for legislation, increased funding, and greater access to mental health services. The depth of her involvement in national reform efforts and the recognition she had earned from federal health agencies and politicians was staggering. In his mind, Rachel was no longer just the face of a protester, but a tireless advocate who had been fighting the very system that had allowed his decision to go unchallenged. As he continued to read, a sense of unease began to settle in his chest. He had, in his own mind, justified the fine as a necessary step to maintain order in the courtroom and prevent protests from disrupting daily life. But now, as he learned more about her, the justification felt shallow and short-sighted. The very causes Rachel had been fighting for, better mental health resources, protection from criminalization, and the removal of stigma, were areas that the judicial system touched every day. He had failed to recognize the urgency of those issues when they stood right in front of him. It wasn't just that Rachel was right. He realized that her protest had tapped into something much deeper than his initial ruling. His fine wasn't just a consequence of a protester stepping out of line. It was a symbol of a system that often overlooked the most vulnerable. The legal system, where he had spent his entire career, was deeply connected to the problems Rachel was speaking out against. Her protest was about more than just policies. It was about the people who were continually failed by those in power. That evening, after hours of reflection, Judge Harris decided to take action. He called his assistant and requested a meeting with Rachel. He didn't expect her to forgive him, nor did he expect to fix the situation overnight. But he needed to speak with her, to understand her cause better, and, if possible, find a way to right the wrong he had unknowingly committed. It was clear to him that something needed to change, not just in how he saw Rachel, but in how he viewed his role as a judge. The following day, he sat anxiously in his office, waiting for Rachel to arrive. When she walked through the door, calm yet resolute, he stood up, offering a handshake. Neither of them knew where this conversation would lead, but it was a moment that neither of them would forget. Rachel walked into Judge Harris's office, her steps measured but her mind racing. She had been skeptical when his office had called to set up the meeting. She wasn't sure if the judge was seeking an apology or simply trying to explain his earlier decision. But something told her that this wasn't going to be just another interaction where the system brushed her off. She had seen it too many times before. Judge Harris stood up when she entered, his posture stiff but respectful. He was a man used to being in control, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes now. He extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Rachel shook it. Neither of them spoke for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. It was clear that both had their own reservations, but the tension was laced with an unspoken understanding that something important was about to unfold. "Thank you for meeting with me," the judge began, his voice steady but with a slight hint of uncertainty. "I've been following your work, Rachel. I must admit, I didn't fully understand the depth of what you're fighting for until recently. And, well, I realize now that I made a mistake." Rachel sat down, keeping her gaze steady. She had anticipated some version of this conversation, but didn't let it soften her resolve. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge Harris, but the reality is, you weren't the only one who made a mistake. The entire system often overlooks the very people I'm fighting for. People with mental health issues are criminalized, ignored, or shuffled around from one underfunded facility to another, and when that happens, they end up in places like this courthouse." Judge Harris nodded, his eyes softening. "I've read about the legislation you've been pushing for, the years you've spent trying to improve things. You've worked at the federal level, connected with organizations, advocated for people who have been abandoned by the system. And I didn't see that when I first looked at you. I saw a protester, and I made a rash decision." Rachel leaned back slightly in her chair, considering his words. It wasn't often that she encountered someone in a position of power who was willing to admit they were wrong. But she could sense something genuine in his tone, an acknowledgement that went beyond the apology. It was the first step in a long journey, she realized. "You're right about one thing," she replied, her voice firm, but not harsh. "The system often fails to understand what it's like to live with mental illness. The fines, the arrests, the lack of treatment, they're symptoms of a deeper problem." Judge Harris was quiet for a moment, clearly processing her words. "I want to understand more," he said finally. "I want to learn from you, Rachel. And if I can, I want to help." Rachel paused, letting his offer sink in. "It's a start, Judge, but it's not enough. If you really want to help, you need to listen. You need to see how the system can be reformed, how people can be treated with dignity instead of punishment." They both knew this was just the beginning, but in that room, something shifted, a glimmer of possibility. Rachel was no longer just fighting against a flawed system. She was now part of a conversation that could bring about real change. And Judge Harris, though uncertain of the road ahead, was ready to walk it with her. The next morning, Judge Harris sat at his desk, staring at the prepared statement in front of him. The words seemed simple, but they carried a weight he hadn't anticipated when he first decided to issue that fine. His office had become a hub of tension ever since Rachel's protest went viral. He had received phone calls from colleagues, family members, and even some local community leaders, each one offering their own take on the situation. Some were supportive, others critical, but it was the outpouring of public response that he couldn't ignore. There had been protests, social media campaigns, and letters from advocates across the nation. The public had learned of Rachel's extensive work in mental health reform, her years of effort to change the very system that had overlooked her protest. As the details came to light, the pressure mounted on Judge Harris to address his role in the matter. After his meeting with Rachel, he knew that apologizing publicly was the right thing to do, not just for Rachel, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked or dismissed by the system. The judge wasn't naive. He understood that an apology wouldn't fix the issues at the core of mental health care, but it was a start. It was the beginning of a shift, a moment of accountability that would have ripples far beyond the courthouse. At noon, with cameras set up in front of the courthouse, Judge Harris stood at the podium, surrounded by reporters. Rachel was seated to his left, calm and composed. The judge cleared his throat, glanced at her, and began speaking. "I want to begin by addressing my actions last week, when I fined Ms. Rachel Johnson for protesting outside this courthouse. When I issued that fine, I did not fully understand the depth of her message or the urgency of the cause she is championing. In the days that followed, I took the time to learn more about Ms. Johnson's work and the struggles many face in the mental health system. What I have come to realize is that I failed to see the bigger picture when I made that decision. I failed to see the very real impact that the lack of proper mental health resources has on our community." He paused, looking directly at the cameras. "I am deeply sorry for the hurt my actions may have caused. It was never my intention to undermine the work that so many of you have dedicated yourselves to. And it certainly wasn't my intention to silence someone who is advocating for the most vulnerable members of our society. I have learned from this experience, and I vow to do better. I am committed to understanding the complexities of mental health reform and supporting efforts to improve our system." Rachel watched him closely, but she could sense the sincerity in his words. This wasn't a political move, it was an honest apology. And though it wasn't enough to undo the damage, it was a step toward something greater. She nodded in approval, her expression softening. "I appreciate your words, Judge Harris," she said after a moment. "And I believe this is the start of a much-needed conversation. But it's just that, a start. The work ahead is still immense." The judge nodded, aware that the road to reform was long and challenging. But for the first time, he felt ready to walk it, side by side with Rachel, and hopefully, with the countless others who had long been waiting for change. In the weeks following Judge Harris' public apology, something remarkable began to unfold in the community. What had started as a seemingly small protest against a local fine had sparked a movement that transcended the courthouse steps. Rachel Johnson's words were now backed by the influence of someone in power, a judge who had been forced to confront his own biases and misconceptions about the mental health crisis. Rachel and Judge Harris met frequently in the days that followed, often in her office, which was filled with stacks of reports, policy briefs, and letters from individuals who had shared their stories with her. Together, they began discussing actionable steps to address the gaps in mental health care, particularly within the justice system. Their first collaborative project was to host a community forum that brought together mental health experts, local law enforcement, judicial officers, and most importantly, those who had lived through the challenges of the mental health system. Rachel's experience and Harris' influence allowed them to attract people from across the state, lawmakers, activists, and healthcare providers. The goal was simple: to create a space where open dialogue could happen and where the true challenges of mental health care could be laid bare. As they worked together, Rachel quickly realized that Judge Harris was no longer the man who had imposed her fine out of ignorance. He was someone who genuinely wanted to make a difference. He had read up on the issues, spoken to families, and even attended local support groups. It was clear he was committed to being a part of the solution, not just a passive observer. He would be the voice in the courtroom pushing for alternatives to jail for those who suffered from mental health crises, and he would work to increase the funding for community-based mental health services. For Rachel, the partnership with Judge Harris felt surreal, but it was also empowering. She had spent years fighting for reform, but now she had a key ally in a position of influence, someone who could help turn her vision into reality. What had once been a solitary fight was now a shared mission. She couldn't ignore the power of having a judge who not only understood the issues, but was willing to take concrete steps to change them. Despite their different paths to this point, Rachel and Harris found common ground in the belief that mental health should not be criminalized. As their partnership deepened, they began drafting a proposal for mental health court diversion programs, a project aimed at steering individuals in crisis away from jail cells and toward the care they desperately needed. Together, they knew that the fight would be long. But for the first time, they both felt a renewed sense of hope that the system could be reformed, and that the voices of those who had been silenced for far too long were finally being heard. But even as they worked together, Rachel couldn't shake the thought that their journey was just beginning. The system was vast and entrenched, and real change would require more than just one judge and one advocate. It would require an entire movement. Months passed, and the momentum Rachel Johnson and Judge Harris had created continued to build. Their collaboration on mental health court diversion programs had started to gain traction. More local judges, law enforcement officials, and healthcare professionals began to take note of their work, inspired by the possibility of a system that treated individuals with mental health issues with compassion rather than punishment. Rachel's tireless advocacy began to pay off. She helped organize a series of workshops and training programs for law enforcement officers to better understand mental health crises and how to respond appropriately. The workshops, which Judge Harris helped facilitate, became the cornerstone of a new community outreach initiative. Police officers, social workers, and paramedics participated in the training, learning how to de-escalate situations without resorting to force or criminal charges. They also learned how to identify the signs of mental health disorders and connect individuals to the appropriate care. Rachel had always known that real change required education at every level, but seeing it unfold was something entirely different. She watched as officers who had once been skeptical of mental health reform began to change their approach. They no longer saw individuals in crisis as criminals to be punished, but as people who needed help. For Rachel, this was a victory in itself, a clear sign that the public conversation was shifting. Judge Harris, too, was taking bold steps. He began advocating for changes to the way mental health cases were processed in his own courtroom. He pushed for the establishment of specialized mental health courts, where individuals could receive appropriate treatment plans and avoid being incarcerated. The idea was simple: If a person was suffering from a mental health disorder, they needed therapy, not punishment. His efforts were slowly gaining ground, but the resistance was still strong. There were those who believed that people with mental illness should be treated like anyone else, regardless of their conditions, and those who feared the changes would create more work for an already strained system. Still, the movement was growing. As Rachel continued to raise awareness, the media coverage grew larger, and the support from mental health advocacy groups poured in. Federal policymakers, recognizing the success of local initiatives, began considering national legislation to fund mental health diversion programs and community care resources more comprehensively. It was slow, but the conversation was finally moving in the right direction. One evening, as Rachel stood in front of a crowd at a mental health rally, she realized how far they had come. The energy in the room was palpable, as people from all walks of life, families, healthcare professionals, advocates, joined together to support a shared cause. Judge Harris, now seated at the front, nodded in agreement as Rachel spoke. "We've come a long way," she said, her voice strong and steady. "But we are just getting started. This movement isn't just about changing the system for one person. It's about changing it for everyone who has been left behind." The crowd erupted in applause. Rachel knew this was just the beginning, but she had never felt more certain that real change was possible. With every voice that joined the fight, the movement grew stronger. And together, they would continue to push for a future where mental health care wasn't a luxury. It was a right for all.